I look back now and realize that there were many ways at some of the best moments of my life I was miserable. I was not happy. I was stressed.
At 53, the tragedy of Jim Parsons from Big Bang Theory is beyond heartbreaking. He earned 4 Emmys, a Golden Globe. For 4 straight years, he was the highest-paid actor on American television. Millions of people watched him every single week and laughed until it hurt. And yet, at 53 years old, Jim Parsons has now said the quiet part out loud. He was miserable for most of it. Not stressed. Not tired. Miserable during the exact years the rest of the world assumed were the best of his life. Stick around because the real story here isn't about a sitcom at all. It's about what one man was quietly carrying underneath it, and where that weight actually came from. Earlier this year, Jim sat down for a podcast conversation and said something he had apparently never put into words quite this directly before. Looking back at some of the biggest moments of his career, he admitted he had been unhappy inside them. He described the feeling as having dozens of plates spinning in the air at once, and living with the constant belief that if a single one slipped, everything he had built would come crashing down with it. From the outside, people read that intensity as discipline, as work ethic, as the mark of a serious, dedicated actor. Jim now describes it very differently, closer to obsession, a compulsive need to control every possible outcome because some part of him never fully believed good things were allowed to simply happen to him without a catch. The conversation didn't stop there either. He revealed that even after 12 seasons and hundreds of episodes of Big Bang Theory, he never once stopped feeling like the most nervous person on set, terrified before nearly every take that his mind would go blank and he'd forget his lines. That fear never matched the calm, confident image audiences saw on their screens week after week. He's since said that pattern cost him real pieces of his actual life, moments with people he cared about that he wasn't fully present for because part of his mind was always somewhere else, running calculations, bracing for the next thing to go wrong. This wasn't a one-off comment he made and moved past either. He's returned to this same idea more than once this year, each time adding a little more detail than the last. So the question worth asking is this. What does it do to a person's mind to spend over a decade afraid of losing something, even while the entire world keeps telling them they've already won? To understand where that fear actually came from, you have to rewind all the way back to 2001, long before Sheldon Cooper was ever a character on a page, to the single day that changed how Jim Parsons related to time for the rest of his life. In the spring of 2001, Jim's father, Milton, died suddenly in a car accident at the age of 52. Jim was only 28 at the time, still years away from booking the role that would define his career, still going through the grind of failed auditions like every other working actor in Los Angeles. His father had spent his life running a plumbing company back home in Houston, and the accident happened while he was driving alone. Jim wouldn't land Big Bang Theory for another 6 years, which means his father never lived to see any of it. Not the Emmys. Not the Golden Globe. Not one single episode of the show that would eventually make his son a household name across the country. Years later, in a television appearance revisiting the loss, Jim was told that nothing medically could have changed the outcome that day, and by his own account, it gave him a kind of peace. But it didn't erase the mental math he had already started doing quietly in the background of his own life. That math became impossible to ignore in 2018. Big Bang Theory was still one of the most watched shows on the planet, and Jim had just turned 46, which he suddenly realized was exactly 6 years younger than his father had been when he died. So he asked himself a question most people spend their entire lives avoiding. If he only had 6 years left, would he really want to spend one more of them playing the same character? His answer was no. Not because he had stopped loving the role, but because he needed to find out what else existed for him before his own clock ran out. He took that decision to the show's producers before he ever brought it to the people he had stood beside on camera for over a decade. His own castmates were reportedly blindsided. Reports at the time described Kaylee Cuoco as visibly shaken by the news, and Johnny Galecki has spoken about feeling caught off guard, less by the decision itself and more by how suddenly he learned about it. Jim's father never got the chance to have a say in how his own story ended. In a strange, quiet way, Jim made sure that he would. But stepping away from Big Bang Theory didn't close the door on grief in his life. It would find him again years later, on a completely different set, in a way that almost feels too strange to be real. In 2025, Jim joined the Hulu comedy Mid-Century Modern, working alongside Nathan Lane, Matt Bomer, and the legendary Linda Lavin. The show followed 3 gay friends who move in together in Palm Springs, with Lavin playing the sharp-tongued mother figure at the center of the group. By every account, she was beloved on that set, not just respected professionally but genuinely adored by cast and crew alike. Then, with only a handful of episodes left to film, Lavin passed away following a fast-moving lung cancer diagnosis that gave almost no one time to process what was happening. The show's creators were left with an impossible decision: quietly recast her, write her character out without explanation, or face the loss head-on inside the story itself. Before she passed, Lavin had reportedly told the writers not to shy away from the truth if anything happened to her. So they chose to honor that. In her final hours, being driven to the hospital, Lavin had reportedly reached for her husband's hand and told him she loved him, just in case. The writers folded a version of that exact moment into the show itself, given to her character in one of the final episodes, in a scene the creators later described as one of the hardest things they've ever had to write. Jim was there filming it, acting alongside Matt Bomer only weeks after losing a real friend, performing grief that wasn't fictional at all. It's the kind of moment that never shows up in a highlight reel or an award acceptance speech, but it stays with a person. And it wasn't even the first time work had forced him to keep going while quietly grieving something enormous. Years earlier, during his very last stretch filming Big Bang Theory, loss found him again in a way that nearly broke him. As the show wound down toward its finale, one of Jim's dogs was nearing the end of his life, and Jim and his husband made the difficult decision to say goodbye at home rather than risk him passing alone at a vet's office while Jim was away working. Just days later, while the rest of the world was gearing up for months of farewell specials and cast tributes celebrating the end of a beloved series, Jim was injured on set. He's since described that stretch as one of the scariest periods of his life, comparing it to standing at the edge of something dark and looking straight down into it. All of this was happening while millions of people were tuning in every week to laugh at Sheldon Cooper's quirks, with absolutely no idea what the man behind the character was quietly carrying. And it's worth remembering this wasn't some passing moment of nerves either. Even years into the role, and even later performing live on Broadway stages, Jim has said the fear of blanking on his lines in front of an audience never fully left him, making him, by his own description, one of the most nervous people in almost any room he's worked in. Long before Hollywood ever knew his name, though, Jim had already spent years mastering the art of hiding pain behind a performance, for a completely different reason. Growing up in a Houston suburb, the son of a plumbing company owner and a schoolteacher, Jim was involved in school plays from elementary school all the way through high school, a passion that never fully left him even during the 1 year he tried walking away from it, convinced acting was too impractical a path and that he should finish a business degree instead. It was watching close friends rehearse, along with encouragement from Todd Spiewak, then his boyfriend, that eventually pulled him back toward the stage. The two of them moved to Los Angeles together so Jim could pursue acting seriously, and he went on to complete a graduate degree in classical theater. But underneath all of that ambition sat a fear that had nothing to do with rejection letters or failed auditions. For years, Jim lived quietly terrified of being discovered as gay. That fear didn't fade with age, and it didn't fade once he moved to New York to chase a career on stage. He said that even seeing a pride parade used to unsettle him, because he knew there were people around him who held hostile views toward exactly who he was. So he avoided LGBTQ-friendly neighborhoods altogether, choosing to blend quietly into ordinary city blocks rather than risk being noticed for who he actually loved. He and Todd were together for roughly a decade before Jim came out publicly, doing so just days after a Big Bang Theory season finale aired. He said that meeting Todd was ultimately the reason he finally had that conversation with his family, because the relationship mattered too much to keep hidden any longer. Jim has admitted he was genuinely afraid the announcement could damage his career, maybe even cost him the show entirely, at a moment when leading men on major network sitcoms rarely came out publicly, especially while playing a character loved by a broad, mainstream audience that wasn't always progressive. Instead, the opposite happened. He said that becoming part of a community that still faces real hostility gave him a strength he didn't expect to find, and if anything, it strengthened his career rather than damaging it. Years before that public moment, the couple had already been quietly recognized for who they were, honored at an award ceremony celebrating them as an inspiring couple, long before marriage equality was the law of the land everywhere in the country. Jim has said he never fully understood being framed that way, insisting he never saw his relationship with Todd as a statement or a form of activism. To him, it was simply an ordinary life built on ordinary love. He and Todd married in 2017, after roughly 15 years together, and Jim has described their day-to-day life since as almost deliberately unremarkable, filled with the same small routines as any other marriage. But even after building a full life with the person he loves, and even after finally being honest with the world about who he is, Jim still couldn't fully outrun the thing that had shaped him since he was 28 years old. Nearly everything Jim has said publicly this year keeps circling back to the same idea: time. He stated plainly that no amount of money could convince him to return to the version of himself that existed during Big Bang Theory's peak years, the version constantly overworking, constantly bracing for something to fall apart. He's called that stretch of his life self-tortured, valuable in hindsight, but not something he'd ever choose to live through again. That's a striking thing to hear from someone who reached the exact level of success most actors spend their whole careers chasing and never find. 4 Emmys. A Golden Globe. A Tony nomination years later for the play Mother Play. A celebrated run in our town. Earlier Broadway credits in The Normal Heart, Harvey, An Act of God, and The Boys in the Band, a role he later reprised on screen. What's easy to forget now is just how close he came to never getting any of it at all. Before Big Bang Theory, Jim reportedly auditioned for dozens of different roles, only to watch pilot after pilot get passed over by networks even after he'd already booked the part. He even auditioned around that same period for the American version of The Office, though it never worked out, and he's since admitted he privately assumed the whole concept sounded like a mistake, a British import American audiences surely wouldn't embrace, a prediction that turned out to be spectacularly wrong. When he finally read for the role of Sheldon Cooper, something about the character clicked immediately, strongly enough that he skipped a party the night before his audition just to keep working on his lines. His first audition reportedly went so well that producer Chuck Lorre assumed it had to be a fluke, bringing Jim back a second time just to be sure the performance hadn't been beginner's luck. It wasn't. In a small, ironic twist, the actor who would go on to play television's most famous fictional physicist reportedly struggled with science himself back in school, something he's chalked up to only being drawn to meteorology because of growing up in an area prone to hurricanes, not because he had any deep love for the subject itself. Years spent directing and executive producing the spin-off Young Sheldon followed, an idea that started as an offhand conversation between Jim and Todd about Jim's own nephew, an unusually bright and different kind of kid, an idea Jim eventually pitched directly to Chuck Lorre without expecting much to come of it. Between 2015 and 2018, Forbes named him the highest-paid actor on American television, a title that made his earlier decade of rejected pilots feel almost unrecognizable in hindsight. Even with a director's credit to his name, Jim has said he still considers himself, at his core, someone who belongs in front of the camera rather than behind it. Today, he's performing nightly on Broadway in the musical Titanic. On paper, it looks like the career of a man who has everything anyone could want. In his own words, though, some of his very best years were spent quietly falling apart while everyone around him assumed he was thriving. So what actually changed? What finally allowed him to stop treating his own success like a threat instead of an achievement? At this year's Tony Awards, Jim showed up without any of the flashy, glamorous styling people associate with his current stage run, and admitted something almost nobody expected to hear from him: that he sometimes worries fans who remember him as Sheldon Cooper will be disappointed by how much older he looks now. He started that role at 34. He's 53 now, 1 year older than his own father ever got to be. When that fact was pointed out to him directly in an interview, Jim called it bonus time, not as a throwaway line, but as something closer to a belief he's actively built the rest of his life around. In a strange twist this same year, right as his most candid interviews in a long time were spreading online, a completely false report claiming Jim had died circulated widely, racking up an enormous amount of engagement before his own representatives had to step in and confirm he was alive and well. For a few strange days, people online were mourning a man who was, at that exact moment, quietly telling the world the opposite, that he finally understood just how limited his actual time really was, and that he intended to spend it differently than before. He said he no longer feels like he has anything left to prove in his career, that he only wants to take on work that genuinely brings him joy, simply because he's fully aware that nobody actually knows how much time they have left. Even now, decades into performing, he's admitted he still walks into every single show fighting that same old fear of blanking on his lines in front of a live audience, a nervousness that apparently never fully disappears no matter how experienced a person becomes. He's also been clear about one thing in particular. No matter what anyone ever offers him, he has no interest in putting Sheldon Cooper's signature cardigan back on for any kind of reboot or revival. That single realization, the one that shaped him at 28, the one that pushed him to walk away from Big Bang Theory at 46, the one that sat quietly beside him on a grieving film set at 52, is still the quiet engine behind nearly everything he does today at 53. In the end, the real tragedy here was never the sitcom ending or the awards on the shelf or the fame itself. It was a man spending decades treating survival like a countdown clock, right up until he finally decided to stop running from it. So here's a question worth sitting with long after this video ends. If you knew exactly how much time you truly had left, would you still be living the way you're living right now? If this story resonated with you, let us know in the comments and subscribe for more honest looks at the lives behind the biggest names in Hollywood. Thanks for watching.